In a bustling city park, a heated argument breaks out as a well-dressed woman confronts an elderly man wearing dog tags, accusing him of glorifying violence. Her sharp words gather a crowd, but the veteran's calm demeanor hides a profound story. As he responds with grace and reveals the meaning behind his dog tags, the entire crowd is left speechless. What starts as a confrontation unravels into an emotional revelation that leaves everyone, including the woman, in tears, teaching a lesson no one expected. The sun hung high over Central Park, casting golden streaks through the leaves of towering trees. Families strolled along the pathways, children laughed as they played, and an elderly man sat on a bench, quiet and unassuming. Gregor Hamilton, dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans, had a small smile as he observed the lively park scene. Around his neck, a set of dog tags glinted faintly in the sunlight. Vanessa Wallace, a sharp-featured woman in her early 30s, marched briskly along the same path. Her tailored suit and glossy heels contrasted starkly with the casual attire of the parkgoers. She was known for fiery speeches and viral videos, calling out societal injustices. Today, she was heading to a nearby event to speak on peace advocacy. Her gaze swept across the park and landed on Gregor. Her steps slowed, her sharp eyes narrowing. There it was, those dog tags, symbols she had come to associate with everything she opposed: war, violence, destruction. Her blood boiled as she imagined the countless lives ruined by war, the grief of families, and the senseless loss of life. She knew nothing about Gregor or his story, but the sight of those tags was enough to ignite her anger. Without hesitation, Vanessa veered off the path and marched toward him. Gregor, noticing her approach, sat up straighter, his expression calm but curious. "Excuse me," Vanessa began, her voice sharp enough to slice through the laughter of nearby children. "I couldn't help but notice your accessory." She gestured at the dog tags. "Do you wear those to glorify war, to show off your so-called service, or to remind the world of the violence you've contributed to?" Gregor's smile faded, but he remained seated, looking up at her with steady eyes. A small crowd began to form, drawn by the tension in the air. Some whispered to one another, while others simply watched. Vanessa continued, her voice louder now. "Do you have any idea what those represent to people like me? To the victims of war, the refugees, the innocent lives caught in the crossfire? Wearing those tags is an insult to peace and everything we should be working toward." The elderly man's face remained unreadable, but a flicker of pain passed through his eyes. He clasped the dog tags in his hand, his fingers brushing over the engraved name. For a moment, he seemed to retreat into himself, his mind wandering to another time, another place. The crowd grew larger, with parents pulling their children closer and couples pausing mid-walk to watch. Some murmured in agreement with Vanessa, while others frowned. "Why aren't you saying anything?" Vanessa demanded, her voice shaking now more from emotion than anger. "Do you think you're better than us because you've seen battle? You're a relic of a violent past we're trying to move beyond." Gregor finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to argue with you, young lady. I'm just sitting here, enjoying the park." His measured response only seemed to infuriate her further. "Enjoying the park? While wearing that? Do you know how many lives were ruined by the wars people like you fought in?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Among them was a young boy who tugged on his father's sleeve. "Daddy," the boy whispered loudly, "why is the lady yelling at the nice man?" The boy's words hung in the air, a small but poignant voice in the growing crowd. Vanessa faltered for a moment but quickly recovered, turning back to Gregor. "Well," she pressed, "do you have anything to say for yourself? Or are you just going to sit there in silence?" Gregor sighed, his hand still clutching the dog tags. He looked around at the crowd, his gaze lingering on the boy who had spoken. Finally, he stood, his tall frame towering over Vanessa. The crowd held its breath. "I wear these," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years, not to glorify war, but to honor those who didn't make it back. These tags don't just belong to me. They belong to the brothers and sisters I lost, the friends who gave their lives so others could live. You see violence, I see sacrifice. You see war, I see the cost of peace." His words silenced Vanessa and the crowd alike. Even the boy stopped fidgeting, his wide eyes fixed on Gregor. The elderly man took a step closer to Vanessa. "You have every right to your opinion," he continued, "but don't assume you know my story, or anyone else's, just by what you see. These tags carry names, faces, lives that mattered, and I'll wear them for as long as I live, not for myself, but for them." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of doubt. The crowd began to disperse, some offering Gregor a nod of respect. The young boy waved shyly before his father led him away. Gregor sat back down, his hand still resting on the dog tags. Vanessa lingered for a moment, her expression conflicted, before finally turning and walking away. The park returned to its usual hum of activity, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air. The crowd had dispersed, but the tension in Vanessa's chest lingered as she walked toward the event hall. The exchange with Gregor replayed in her mind, his calm demeanor juxtaposed with the torrent of emotions she had unleashed on him. "You see war. I see the cost of peace." The line echoed in her head as she tried to push the interaction away. Vanessa entered the bustling hall filled with peace advocates and activists. Banners reading, "A world beyond conflict," adorned the walls. Familiar faces greeted her, but she found it difficult to engage. Her colleague, Rachel Flores, approached her with a warm grin. "Vanessa, I'm glad you're here. Are you ready for your speech?" Vanessa nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course." Rachel tilted her head. "You okay? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," Vanessa replied quickly, "just a little preoccupied." Gregor's words had left her with questions she couldn't answer. She had been so certain of her stance, but the conviction in his voice had shaken something deep within her. As Rachel walked away, Vanessa pulled out her note cards and reviewed her talking points, but the words seemed hollow. The event began, and Vanessa watched as other speakers took the stage, delivering passionate calls for peace. Yet, instead of inspiring her, their words felt distant. Her mind kept drifting back to the park, to Gregor's weathered face and the weight of his dog tags. When her name was called, Vanessa took the stage. She looked out at the audience, dozens of eager faces awaiting her words, and for the first time she hesitated. Her polished speech suddenly felt inadequate. She glanced at her notes, then set them down. "Today, I plan to talk about our mission to build a world free from conflict," Vanessa began. "But something happened earlier that I need to share with you." The room grew quiet. On my way here, I saw an elderly man wearing dog tags. Instantly, I assumed I knew everything about him, his beliefs, his past, his values. I confronted him, accused him of glorifying war, and called him a relic of a violent past. Her voice wavered, but he said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said, "You see war, I see the cost of peace." The audience listened intently, some nodding in understanding. He told me the tags weren't a symbol of violence. They were a tribute to those he had lost. Friends, comrades, people who gave their lives so others could live. And I realized I judged him without knowing his story. Vanessa paused. How many of us are guilty of that? Judging without understanding? Speaking without listening? The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Peace isn't just the absence of conflict. It's the presence of understanding, compassion, and the willingness to hear stories that challenge our own perspectives. I thought I was here to teach, but today I realized I have so much to learn. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, but Vanessa didn't feel triumphant. She felt vulnerable. Exposing her own shortcomings had been difficult, but necessary. As she stepped off the stage, Rachel met her with an expression of both surprise and admiration. "That was unexpected," Rachel said, "but powerful." Vanessa nodded, her mind still elsewhere. "Thanks." After the event, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that her interaction with Gregor wasn't over. She needed answers, not just about him, but about herself. She found herself walking back to the park, her heels clicking against the pavement. The sky had darkened, and the air was cooler, but the park was still alive with activity. To her relief, Gregor was still there, sitting on the same bench. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were distant, as if lost in thought. Vanessa approached cautiously, her usual confidence tempered by humility. "May I sit?" she asked softly. Gregor looked up, his expression unreadable, then gestured to the empty spot beside him. "It's a free country," he said with a faint smile. Vanessa sat, clasping her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the park filling the silence. Finally, Vanessa broke the quiet. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For earlier, I was wrong to judge you." Gregor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the dog tags around his neck, holding them in his hand. "It's not the first time someone's judged me," he said finally, "and it won't be the last." Vanessa looked at the tags, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. "Whose name is on them?" Gregor's eyes softened. "James Carter. He was my best friend. We served together. He saved my life." Vanessa's chest tightened. What happened? Gregor let out a long breath. "That's a story for another time. But what you need to understand is that these tags aren't about me. They're about the people who didn't make it back, the ones who gave everything." Vanessa nodded, her earlier assumptions crumbling with each word he spoke. "I think I needed to hear that," she admitted. "Thank you." Gregor smiled faintly. "It's a start." As Vanessa left the park that evening, she felt a shift within herself. The conversation had been brief, but it had planted a seed, a desire to listen, to learn, and to approach others with more compassion. The world wasn't black and white, and neither were the people in it. Vanessa couldn't shake the weight of her conversation with Gregor. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking not just about him, but about the broader stories she had ignored in her activism. Her fight for peace had always been driven by passion, but now she realized that passion, without understanding, could lead to division instead of unity. Determined to understand Gregor's story better, she headed back to the park. It was a sunny afternoon, and the park was alive with activity. Sitting on the same bench, Gregor seemed almost like a fixture of the park, his quiet demeanor contrasting with the bustle around him. Vanessa approached cautiously, carrying a cup of coffee. "Good afternoon," she greeted, holding the coffee out to him. Gregor glanced up, his expression softening when he recognized her. "Afternoon," he replied, accepting the cup. "Back for round 2? Vanessa chuckled. "Not exactly. I was hoping you'd tell me more about your story, if you're willing." Gregor took a sip of the coffee, his gaze drifting across the park. "You're persistent, aren't you?" "I prefer curious," Vanessa said with a small smile. He let out a low chuckle. "Fair enough. What do you want to know?" "James Carter," Vanessa said softly. "You said he saved your life." Gregor's face grew serious, and for a moment Vanessa thought he might refuse. But then he began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "James and I grew up in the same town. We were like brothers, inseparable from the time we were kids. When we turned 18, we both enlisted. We thought it was the right thing to do, to serve our country, to protect the people we loved." He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We were sent overseas. It was nothing like we'd imagined. The things we saw, the things we had to do, They change you. Vanessa listened intently, her earlier assumptions about war and soldiers crumbling with each word he spoke. One day, we were on patrol. It was supposed to be routine, but there's no such thing as routine out there. We were ambushed. Gunfire, explosions. It was chaos. I was hit. Couldn't move. James could have gotten out, but he stayed. He pulled me to safety, got me out of there. But he didn't make it. Gregor's voice faltered, and he took a moment to compose himself. He gave his life so I could live. That's what these tags mean. They're not a trophy. They're a reminder of what I owe him. Vanessa's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." Gregor shook his head. "You don't need to apologize. Just don't forget, people like James, they're the reason we get to sit here in this park, drinking coffee and talking about peace." For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Finally, Vanessa spoke. "I think I've been going about this all wrong," she admitted. "I've been so focused on the idea of peace that I forgot to understand the people who fought for it." Gregor glanced at her, a hint of a smile on his face. "Understanding goes a long way. It's what bridges the gaps between us." Vanessa nodded, her mind racing with thoughts. "I want to do better," she said. "I want to tell stories like yours. Stories that remind people of the cost of peace, the sacrifices that have been made. Maybe then, people will listen." Gregor studied her for a moment before nodding. "If that's what you want to do, then do it. But don't just tell my story. There are so many others out there, stories that need to be heard." Vanessa smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I will." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Vanessa and Gregor sat in companionable silence. It wasn't the end of their conversation. Far from it. It was the beginning of something new, a partnership rooted in understanding and a shared desire to make the world a little better. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa began reaching out to veterans, listening to their stories and documenting their experiences. She discovered a depth of humanity she had never fully appreciated before, stories of courage, loss, and resilience. Each story she heard reshaped her understanding of the world and her place in it. Her platform, once a space for fiery speeches and bold declarations, transformed into a hub for storytelling and connection. Through her work, Vanessa began to see the impact of her newfound approach. People who had once argued against her now reached out to thank her for sharing perspectives they hadn't considered. One evening, Vanessa sat at her desk, reviewing an email from a young woman whose father had been a soldier. The woman wrote about how Vanessa's work had helped her reconnect with her father's memory, giving her a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. Vanessa felt a lump in her throat as she read, realizing the ripple effect of understanding and compassion. She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting back to Gregor. He had been right. Understanding was the key. It didn't erase the pain or the scars, but it built bridges, fostered connection, and reminded people of their shared humanity. Vanessa smiled, her resolve stronger than ever. This was only the beginning. Vanessa's transformation wasn't without challenges. While her new approach garnered praise, it also drew criticism. Some supporters of her former activism claimed she was siding with the enemy by focusing on veterans' stories. Vanessa tried to ignore the comments, but they stung. She had always been steadfast in her beliefs, but now she realized her beliefs were evolving. One evening, Vanessa sat scrolling through emails when one caught her attention. The subject line read, "My husband's story." Intrigued, she opened it. The email was from Clara Reyes, whose husband Marco had served in the military. Clara wanted to meet Vanessa to share Marco's story. Vanessa agreed immediately, arranging to meet the next afternoon at a nearby cafe. The following day, Vanessa arrived early, nervous but curious. Clara, a petite woman with kind eyes and quiet strength, greeted her warmly. They sat at a corner table. "Thank you for meeting me," Clara began, her voice steady but emotional. "Your work gave me the courage to speak out." Vanessa smiled. "Thank you for reaching out. I'm honored to hear your story." Clara took a deep breath. "Marco was my high school sweetheart. Full of life, always making people laugh. When he joined the military, I supported him, though it scared me. He wanted to protect what he loved." She paused, her eyes glistening. "He served 2 tours overseas. When he came back, he wasn't the same. The things he'd seen haunted him." Vanessa listened intently. "He struggled for years," Clara continued. "He tried to adjust, to move forward, but it was so hard. He felt like no one understood him. And one day," her voice broke, "he couldn't fight it anymore. He took his own life." Vanessa's breath caught. "Clara, I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Clara nodded, her composure fragile but unwavering. "It's been the hardest thing I've ever gone through. But I want people to know Marco's story. Not just the pain, but who he was. He was more than a soldier. He was a husband, a friend, a man who loved deeply. I don't want his sacrifice forgotten." Vanessa reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Clara's. "I promise, I'll honor Marco's memory." In the weeks that followed, Vanessa dedicated herself to documenting Marco's life. She interviewed Clara multiple times, spoke with Marco's friends and family, and pored over photos and letters. The more she learned, the more she felt connected to his journey. When the story was finally published, it struck a chord with readers. Messages poured in, not just for Clara, but for all veterans and their families. People shared their own stories, creating a sense of community. Amid the praise, there were dissenting voices. Some accused Vanessa of glorifying war. She struggled with these criticisms but reminded herself of her purpose. It wasn't about choosing sides, it was about bridging divides. One evening, Vanessa received a call from Gregor. His voice was warm, carrying a note of pride. "I read Marco's story," he said. "You did good, Vanessa. You honored him." "Thank you, Gregor," Vanessa replied, "but there's still so much work to do." "There always will be," Gregor said, "but you've taken the first steps. That's what matters." Vanessa smiled, feeling renewed determination. Gregor was right. There was still much to do, but she was ready. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa collected more stories, deepening her understanding of the human cost of war. She began collaborating with organizations supporting veterans and their families, using her platform to amplify their voices. Her work began shifting public perceptions, fostering empathy in ways she hadn't thought possible. People from all walks of life, veterans, activists, civilians, found common ground through the stories she shared. One day, Vanessa received an invitation to speak at a national conference on peace and reconciliation. The invitation was both an honor and a challenge. She knew the audience would include people with differing views, some supportive, others skeptical. But Vanessa was ready. As she stood backstage preparing to take the stage, she thought about the people who had trusted her with their stories. Gregor, Clara, Marco. Their voices echoed in her mind, a reminder of the responsibility she carried. When her name was called, Vanessa stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her determined expression. She looked out at the audience, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. "Today, I'm not here to speak about my beliefs," she began. "I'm here to share the stories of people who've lived through the realities of war, their struggles, their sacrifices, their humanity. These stories aren't about choosing sides. They're about understanding, connection, and finding a path forward together." As she spoke, the room grew silent, her words resonating with the audience. For Vanessa, this was more than a speech. It was a call to action, a plea for compassion and unity in a divided world. When she finished, the applause was deafening, but Vanessa knew her work was far from over. This was just the beginning. Not just for her, but for everyone her work touched. Vanessa's platform was thriving, and her work was gaining traction, but she knew the path she had chosen wasn't easy. For every story of hope she shared, there was an equal dose of pain. Yet she pressed on, fueled by the resilience of the people she met. Their voices guided her, reminding her of the importance of her mission. One day, Vanessa received an invitation to visit a veteran support center in her city. The center's director, Henry Lawson, had seen her work and believed she could help bring attention to the struggles veterans faced in reintegrating into society. Vanessa accepted, eager to learn more. The center was located in a modest building on the edge of town. When Vanessa arrived, she was greeted by Henry, a middle-aged man with a firm handshake and kind eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said. "We've been following your work, and I think you'll find some important stories here." Henry led Vanessa through the center, introducing her to the staff and veterans who frequented the facility. Each person had a unique story, but common threads of resilience and struggle ran through them all. Vanessa spent hours at the center, speaking with veterans and listening to their experiences. One man, Alan, shared how he had struggled with PTSD after returning from combat. "For years, I felt like I was carrying a weight no one could see," he said. "Coming here, meeting people who understood, saved my life." Another veteran, Maria, spoke about her difficulties finding work after leaving the military. "People look at you differently when they know you've served," she said. "They think you're damaged or unstable. It's exhausting." Vanessa realized that while the world often celebrated the bravery of soldiers in battle, it rarely acknowledged the battles they fought after coming home. Later, Henry shared the challenges the center faced: limited funding, lack of public awareness, and stigma surrounding mental health. "We're doing what we can," he said, "but there's so much more that needs to be done." Vanessa nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. "I want to help," she said. "I can use my platform to bring attention to what you're doing here." Henry smiled. "That would mean the world to us." In the weeks that followed, Vanessa worked closely with the center to create articles and videos highlighting the struggles and triumphs of the veterans she met. She featured Alan's healing journey, Maria's fight for employment, and the tireless work of the staff. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, and the center received messages of support from across the country. People volunteered their time and resources, inspired by the stories Vanessa shared. Amid the success, Vanessa reflected on her journey. She thought about the person she had been before meeting Gregor, the activist so quick to judge, so certain of her perspective. Now, she saw the world through a lens shaped by compassion and understanding. One evening, Vanessa received a call from Clara. "Vanessa," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "thank you. Because of your work, I've connected with other families who've lost loved ones. It's been healing to share our stories." Vanessa felt a lump in her throat. "Clara, thank you for trusting me with Marco's story. None of this would have been possible without you." Later that night, Vanessa received an email from a young man named Liam. He was a high school senior considering enlisting in the military. "Your work has given me a lot to think about," he wrote. "I used to see the military as this glorified thing, but now I understand the sacrifices it involves. Thank you for opening my eyes." Vanessa stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. She hadn't set out to change minds, but knowing her work sparked thoughtful conversations gave her purpose. As the months passed, Vanessa continued her work, but she also explored ways to create lasting change. She partnered with Henry to advocate for policy reforms to provide better support for veterans. Together, they met with lawmakers, shared stories, and pushed for increased funding for mental health services and job training programs. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Progress was slow but steady. Laws were passed, funding was allocated, and awareness grew. Vanessa felt fulfilled, knowing she was making a tangible difference. One day, Vanessa received a package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Gregor and a small box. She opened the letter first. "Vanessa," it read, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. You've given a voice to people who've gone unheard for too long. I hope you'll continue this work, no matter where it takes you. Inside the box is something I'd like you to have. It's not much, but it's a reminder of why we do what we do. Gregor." Vanessa opened the box to find a small medal. It was worn but beautiful, a token of honor and sacrifice. Tears filled her eyes as she held it in her hands. In that moment, Vanessa realized how far she had come and how far she still had to go. But she was ready. Her journey wasn't just about telling stories. It was about creating a world where those stories led to understanding, compassion, and change. Vanessa's work had grown beyond a passion. It was now a movement. Her storytelling inspired change in ways she hadn't imagined, but she knew there were still larger bridges to build. One day, Vanessa received an invitation from Unity Beyond Borders, an international organization promoting reconciliation in war-torn regions. They invited her to a global summit in Geneva on healing and understanding. It was an opportunity to connect with others who shared her vision for unity and peace. The summit brought together activists, veterans, survivors, and leaders from around the world. Each carried scars and stories of resilience. Vanessa listened in awe as speakers recounted their experiences, former soldiers working together for peace, survivors turning pain into advocacy, and communities rebuilding trust after decades of division. The stories were heartbreaking but hopeful, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and heal. When it was Vanessa's turn to speak, she took the stage with a mix of gratitude and responsibility. She began by sharing how meeting Gregor had changed her life. "Gregor told me, 'You see war, I see the cost of peace,'" Vanessa said. "His words made me realize how often we judge without understanding, how easy it is to see the surface without looking deeper. Through his story, I learned that understanding is the foundation of peace." She spoke about Clara and Marco, Alan and Maria, and countless others. These stories are not just about individuals, they're about all of us. They remind us of our shared humanity, of the bridges we can build when we choose to listen. It's through listening and understanding that we begin to heal. The room was silent as she spoke, her words settling over the audience like a soft wave. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, but Vanessa felt humbled, knowing how much more there was to do. For her, the summit wasn't the culmination of her journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter. After her speech, Vanessa spent hours connecting with others at the summit. She listened to stories from communities torn apart by war and survivors rebuilding their lives. She heard from activists fighting for justice and reconciliation, each story deepening her understanding of conflict's complexities and the resilience of the human spirit. One evening, as the summit wound down, Vanessa found herself in conversation with Amara, who had fled her war-torn homeland as a child and now worked to reunite families separated by conflict. "What drives you?" Vanessa asked, genuinely curious. Amara smiled softly. "Hope," she said. "Hope that even in the darkest times we can find light. Hope that the pain we've endured can lead to something better. Hope is what keeps me going." Vanessa felt a sense of kinship with Amara. Their paths were different, but their goals were the same: to heal, to connect, to create a better world. The conversation left Vanessa deeply inspired, reaffirming her commitment to her work. When Vanessa returned home, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The summit had shown her that her work was part of something larger, a global effort to build understanding and reconciliation. She began collaborating with international organizations, sharing stories that transcended borders and amplified the voices of those often unheard. Her work continued to evolve. She launched a podcast, inviting guests from around the world to share their experiences. She organized storytelling workshops, empowering others to tell their stories. and she remained deeply connected to the veterans, families, and advocates who had shaped her journey from the beginning. One day, Vanessa received a call from Gregor. His voice was weaker, but carried the same warmth. "Vanessa," he said, "I'm proud of you. You've done more than I ever imagined." Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. "Thank you, Gregor, but I couldn't have done this without you." Gregor chuckled softly. "You've taken it further than I ever thought possible. Keep going." A few weeks later, Vanessa learned that Gregor had passed away. His loss hit her deeply, but it also strengthened her resolve. She dedicated her next project to him, creating a series of stories about veterans and advocates who, like Gregor, had turned their experiences into forces for good. The project became a cornerstone of her work, a tribute to the man who had shown her the power of understanding. As years passed, Vanessa's work grew. She became a voice for understanding, a bridge between worlds that often seemed irreconcilable. Her journey was far from over, but she embraced the challenges ahead with an open heart. One day, preparing for another speech, Vanessa reflected on Gregor, Clara, and Marco, and all the people who had entrusted her with their stories. She thought of the bridges they had built together and the lives they had touched. "This isn't my story," she began as she stepped onto the stage. "It's ours. Together, we can create a future where understanding and compassion lead the way." The audience rose to their feet, applauding the power of stories and the bridges they had built together. Vanessa smiled, ready for whatever came next.